Today at shopdap.com, we're going to be installing a forged turbo muffler delete on a Mark 7 GTI. Okay, so before we get into our install, let's talk about turbo muffler deletes, the intention of it, why you might want one, and let's go down the road of that. So there are a lot of different turbo muffler deletes out there. And the most common question we get is, does it make more power, and should I buy one? So a lot of these are going to add incremental power. There's not a lot of power you're going to gain from something like this. What it does do is, because of the factory turbo muffler actually has the ability to muffle sound, it does so by diverting the air in ways that's going to create some turbulence within the system. So you're not really maximizing flow. So you're not going to see huge power gains from this. You will see a slight gain in power, and then you'll also get some sound from this. So if you're looking for that type of setup, then this is for you. And then in terms of the variants, there's a lot of different versions of this out there. They range very widely in price. My preference is this particular style because it uses the style that seals against the turbo itself, whereas you're going to get kind of a clean flow coming through. Some of them don't seat and seal quite the same way as the forged one and some of the other ones out there, which is why I recommend going down this road, because you know when you're getting a good seal, you're maximizing the flow of through there, as opposed to if you don't have a solid seal through there, it could again create that same turbulence that you're trying to avoid by getting rid of the muffler in the first place. With that said, let's get into our install. Okay, so to start with removing our turbo muffler delete, it's actually, the muffler delete is back here. We're going to remove our intake system here. This is an R600 intake, which we have installed. We do have a DIY video on this, so if you have a factory intake and you want to make sure that you're taking out the factory intake correctly, we will link to the install video for the R600 where you can see the removal of the factory intake there. And I'll throw our magnetic bolt tray over here so that we can not lose any of these screws along the way. I'm going to remove this secondary air pump hose from the side of the intake here. And now we're going to take off this clamp here. These spring clamps do have these special pliers, which we do offer, so you can use a regular pair of pliers to try to get them off. You will struggle oftentimes because of the style that they kind of hook on, so it'll be hard to keep them in place if you don't use this type of plier, but we will link to them in the description if you'd like them. If not, again, you can try to use a regular pair of pliers. It can work, it's just a little more challenging. We have this vacuum hose here on this particular intake. It's on the side of the filter housing here. What I like to do is take a pick, because a lot of times these hoses will be tough to pull off. Take a pick with either a 90 or a 45, kind of run it inside the hose, and then you kind of work it around. You'll kind of break that seal that the hose has on whatever it's on, and then you should be able to just work it off from there. Now what we're going to do is pop this intake up. And you got to be careful, because in our circumstance here, we have this hose here, so we can't get too crazy with yanking on this, because you can potentially damage that hose. If you pull on that too hard, it'll break this nipple off this radiator coupler right here. And we're going to pop this cover out of the way. Now our intake is out. All right, now we're gonna get this hose out of the way. I'm not sure you're necessarily gonna need to do this, but we're gonna try to do this just because I think it's probably best for visibility during this install. And we're just using a 7mm socket. You also can use a flathead on this. Now your setup is going to look a little bit different because we do have the forge blow-off valve on this car. So this is the solenoid valve for that, and then the hose routing and stuff like that. Now we're going to take our battery out, and these are just two 10 millimeters. And what you're going to do is always, when you're going off, take the negative off first, and then when you're going on, always put the positive on first. So take our negative off, and you got to make sure you obviously don't ground it out, because if you ground it out, it's going to basically make another connection. And then you're all set. For the battery cables, you will need to take the 13 millimeter off that actually mounts the battery in place here. Now that we have the 13 off, I'm going to pull this battery blanket off just so we can get a little more visibility. And then on the side here, you actually can pop this up. This is what's locking this in place. It kind of hooks into the base here, and you just got to pull it up from the side of the battery and move it out of the way. Now we can slide our battery forward. And get it out of the way. Okay, so I'm not sure you're going to need to do this in general, probably not going to need to, but we're going to remove this battery tray because it will likely give us more access to give you better views of actually removing the turbo muffler delete. So we're going to pop this off real quick. And now that we pop that out of the way, we're going to take our 10 millimeters and hold this in place out. And there's two there, and then there's one that mounts to the side here. And this one doesn't need to come out all the way, it just needs to be loosened up enough that it can slide out of the way. And the last 10 millimeter can be found right here near the headlight assembly. And we're going to get this other tin out here. Just a little more play here. Now the last thing before we get in tight, your turbo muffler deletes over here, but this pipe actually will need to be loosened to give us the play we need. And so we're just going to take a T30 and loosen that up, and it will just hang free there. Okay, now we're going to be taking this coupler off the boost pipe here. So this is a 7 millimeter or a flathead. If you take a look here, this is the vacuum pump for the engine. It's pretty much a finger between that and the clamp you actually need to. So there's no way you're getting a flathead in there, and you're not going to get a socket in there either. So we have a 7 millimeter wrench that we're going to use to loosen that up, and it's probably going to take us a little while. Now, I'm also going to move this connector, which is for the solenoid for our blow-off valve, out of the way. If you do not have any setup like this, you're not even going to have anything there at all. This entire valve right here is only for a blow-off valve and has no other purpose because you add it when you add the blow-off valve. Okay, so now we have this clamp loose. As you can see, I can spin it around there. One trick I actually found to work well is actually if you can lean down a little bit on this, it will expose more of this, so it'll allow you a little more access to that clamp itself. So we can kind of get that out of the way. And so what I'm gonna do is rotate that over to here. And what I'd like to do is, like I mentioned earlier, when anytime I like to do with hoses, I can kind of pop a pick in there and run it around. Now it'll make getting this pipe off way easier. And we should be able to just run it out of there. As you can see, that has now cleared, and we are out of the coupler. Okay, so if you look down below these hoses here, we should be focused on this clamp, that's the upper clamp. And we're now going to take this one off, and this is directly on the turbo muffler itself. And again, you can do whatever you prefer, either a flathead or a ratchet. We're choosing a flathead in this particular instance because I think it'd be easier for you to see so we don't block anything. Now that we have that loose, we should be able to just move this clamp out of the way. And we should be able to just wiggle this rubber boot off the old turbo. Now if you take a look here from below where we have our GoPro mounted up, you can see your 3 5mm Allens, and you can go ahead and remove them. Now I've cracked them all loose, and I'm going to thread them out by hand, and we should be able to remove our turbo muffler. One note I would suggest is that because turbo mufflers or outlets of turbos oftentimes will have oil, you may want to stick a rag underneath to prevent as much oil from leaking onto the car as possible. You will want to be super careful when you're taking these screws out, because once they're loose, they're going to drop. So you can either get a magnet or just make sure you have your fingers on them when you're getting them out. As you can see, once you take that last screw out, the muffler delete kind of just falls out on its own. So here we have it. Get that out of the way. Now as you can look here, we have them both side by side. You can see that the forged one is actually longer and actually is deeper in, which is where it seals against the turbo itself. And again, it's smooth all the way through, as opposed to the holes here to have the air go through and kind of around, and this will prevent turbulence. And again, this was intended to have less noise. So let's go ahead and pop our new one in. Now what I'm going to do real quick is take a little bit of this oil that's in that hole, kind of run it around the seal here, because you want to make sure that that goes in smoothly. So I'll move our GoPro out of the way there for a sec. And kind of wiggle, kind of feel it seat in place. Once you're there all the way, you will want to just make sure you can kind of push up against it. I would then double check all your holes to make sure they're lined up. And then I would thread in your screws. So I'll get our first 5mm. I would always suggest when you're threading in a screw like this, just thread in the easiest one first. That way you know you get it lined up. I wouldn't tighten it all the way, but I'd thread it in all the way, because you want to make sure you have a little bit of play left to work with. Then I would do the next easiest, which I believe is going to be our bottom one. And I'm going to take our extension and do the top one. And I would eye this one from the top. Now you can see we have our forged muffler delete in there, our 3 screws in there, and now we can go ahead and snug them up and then reinstall the hose. Now that we snug those up, we can actually reinstall our hose here, and what I would suggest you do is take it, this is already correctly oriented, basically in place. You're gonna wanna slide that in place. You may wanna clean off some of this oil that's in the hose a little bit first. Again, that is normal. And you're gonna need to swing this pipe out of the way a little bit. And what you may consider doing is slide it onto the pipe. At least start it that way, and then move it towards the turbo itself. And what I always suggest in these situations doing is make sure you have the hoses in an orientation that makes sense to make it as easy as possible. So you can see the hose kind of popped on there, but the clamp's not on there yet, so I have to take it back off. All right, so now we have our clamp back on there. Slide that back in place, and again, focus on the orientation of these clamps, because as you tighten them, they'll move a little, but you also want to be able to continue to access them with ease. You will want to make sure that these clamps are in the correct place, because keep in mind, this is where the boost comes out of the turbo, so there will be a lot of pressure in these hoses, and if you don't have them tightened properly, you will actually potentially blow these clamps off. And remember, don't forget your rag under your hood, because you will cause a fire. And our ratchet is generally going to be a better choice when it comes to this particular clamp in general, just because it's hard to do this with a flathead. You'll be turning for a long time. Now that's back in place, we can take our T30, snug that up. That's threaded in there, so we're just going to hit it with the impact real quick. And now we are going to get all of our other stuff plugged back in, including this blow-off valve hose or connector that we unplugged. Okay, so we can start by reinstalling our battery tray, and you likely did not remove this, so there's nothing to worry about there. Now, you likely did not take out the battery tray, but I'm just gonna give you this tip in case you did. These I do not hit with an impact, at least initially, because they actually don't thread in super clean because of it's a little bit of a snug mounting. So I always like to thread them in by hand mostly first to make sure that they're threading in there cleanly before hitting them with an impact. Because if you hit them with an impact before you make sure they're cleanly threaded, you could strip them, and you will really regret that if you do. Now that is mounted in place. We have our hold down here. Again, it just hooks right here. $13. Get a little pressure on it backwards. Gives us the space we need. Now I'm also going to, instead of reinstalling the factory intake hose here, we're actually going to be installing a forged one here. And as you can see, there's a pretty big difference between the two. So this one should free flower, and also because it doesn't have this corrugated stuff, it actually should improve airflow and, again, turbulence in the inside of this pipe as well. So we're going to go ahead and swap that on there. Now with this, I would suggest make sure that you have a good orientation of this hose, this clamp in the back, because that one is going to be tough to get to when the time comes if you have it in a bad place. And I don't really like this orientation of that clamp, so I'm going to turn it around and then upside down, so that way I can just tighten it right from the bottom here. I'm gonna turn that up, tighten it straight down there. Make sure you're seated all the way down in that turbo inlet, and then we'll snug that up. Now these don't require to be quite as tight as the other ones because this hose is not under pressure. This is just where the airflow comes in. So you're not going to, you could never blow this off in a circumstance of actually like a high boost situation. So also one note I wanted to mention is on the inlet of this turbo, a lot of people like to maybe put a rag in there or something like that when they're installing stuff like this because they're afraid they're going to drop something. It's not a bad idea. It's not my habit as a technician. Technicians generally wouldn't do something like that unless they were leaving it for long periods of time. Okay, so now we're going to reinstall our battery cables now that we have the battery tray in place here. And much like I mentioned previously, positive first, then negative. Now with battery terminals, you want to be careful because just tap them slightly with an impact. You don't go crazy tightening these because if you snug them up and down too many times, it'll stretch out the end of the cable and then you'll have a hard time getting them tight. And now we're going to swap our R600 back in place. And got our secondary air hose hanging us up a little bit. Radiator here. There we go. It kind of falls in place there once you get it in. Now we're not mounted in place all the way. We do have the basic setup in. The bottom has to be bumped into place. So what I'm going to do first in this situation is I'm going to get the bottom mounted in place and then I'm going to pop our filter in. And that's just these two mounting grommets here that go onto these studs. And those are pretty obvious when you're mounted in place. You can't just give them a little push inside. Now we'll throw our filter on real quick. Okay, so now we have that in place. We have to loosen this clamp up a little bit more just to get this in place. Again, these hoses are pretty rigid, so you will need to make sure you have the space you need. And put this hose back in place. And then we can slide this cover in place here. All right. Now we can pop our secondary air pipe on. And we'll snug up this clamp. Now, some people are going to want to rotate this clamp below just for aesthetics, but we are going to just leave it here just for video purposes. And we're all set there. Now we can get all of our torque screws in on top of our intake, and then we'll be all set. Thanks so much for watching our DIY on how to install a turbo muffler delete and an upgraded intake hose on a Mark 7 GTI. Again, purchases for parts like this or any others help support videos just like this one. If you like this video, be sure to give it a thumbs up and subscribe for more like it.